Throughout the summer of 1942, as the horror of World War II rumbled on, Imperial Japan knew it needed to destroy the United States' power in the Pacific Ocean. To do that, it would need to take control of the strategically important Midway Atoll. Sitting equidistant from Asia and North America, this small, isolated area ultimately came to host one of the most devastating naval battles in history. Many lives were lost as ships were destroyed, condemned to the bottom of the sea, where their wrecks remain to this day. The watery depths around Midway are now something of a ship graveyard, and a new underwater survey has given us a chilling glimpse into what that actually looks like. Never before seen images of the underwater wreckage from the Battle of Midway. Across 5 days in September 2023, a crew from the Ocean Exploration Trust ran this remarkable operation from aboard the Nautilus. They sailed to the Papanamoku Key Marine National Monument, which is the largest conservation area in the world to officially enjoy U.S. protection. This special conservation area happens to be where the victims of the Battle of Midway sank to their watery graves. It's here where the crew of explorers would have to get to work. No project of this kind had ever been attempted in this area before. So, if the experts managed to pull off what they were attempting, it would constitute a notable achievement. Nobody had ever laid eyes on these historically significant ships since they were lost all those decades ago. Vessels from both sides of the battle sank at Midway, and, as it happens, both Japanese and American ships were discovered throughout the course of the survey. It was an incredible feat. In practical terms, the aims of this survey project were to pinpoint the location the lost ships of Midway and to check out what sort of condition they were now in. But beyond that, there was another objective. One that was almost more spiritual than anything else. According to the Ocean Exploration Trust team itself, an important part of their mission was to honor the lives that had been lost during the Battle of Midway. There had been, sadly, a great number of casualties on both sides. From a technical point of view, the survey wasn't an easy task to complete. After all, the depths at which the sunken ships now sit are barely comprehensible. In order to catch a glimpse of them, the team had to send a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, to a tremendous depth beneath the Nautilus. There were 3 dives, with the ROV sinking to more than 16,500 feet below sea level. That was unprecedented. No other mission launched from the Nautilus had ever gone so deep. A whole host of experts were involved in this mission. Aside from the team who were directly running things, academics from all across the planet were following developments and were actually given the opportunity to communicate with the Ocean Exploration Trust. Significantly, archaeologists from both Japan and the United States were involved. This wasn't just a project for deep water explorers and scientists, though. The public was given the opportunity to follow developments via a livestream. People could just log onto a website and see what the ROV was seeing in real time. When it came to the more spiritual aspects of the mission, people from Japan, the United States, and the indigenous Hawaiian community came together to participate in a ceremony either side of each dive that took place. This was to remember the lives that had been lost. If you're wondering about the significance of the native Hawaiian community at these ceremonies, it's because Midway Island is actually a part of the wider Hawaiian archipelago. Having said that, it isn't considered to be in the state of Hawaii. A Japanese minister reflected on the significance of the operation in a statement published after the dives had taken place. Kasei Nomura, the head of the economics section at the Embassy of Japan, said, "On this occasion, we meet on those same Pacific waters in which Japan and the US once met in battle, but this time as allies and fellow researchers. We are reminded that today's peace and tomorrow's discoveries are built on the sacrifices of war, and so in my view, it is meaningful that Japan and the US are now deepening their cooperation at Midway, utilizing such cutting-edge technology. Many sacrifices were made at the Battle of Midway. It came in the wake of the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which had been a terrible day for the Americans. 4 battleships and 188 aircraft were destroyed, and a grueling World War II campaign was set underway. The following May, US and Japanese forces engaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Neither side dealt the other a killer blow, but the Japanese emerged in marginally better shape. This set the scene for what would come to be known as the Battle of Midway. Led by Marshal Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese came up with a plan to destroy several American aircraft carriers that at the time were perceived to be vital to the U.S. war effort. The reputation of these carriers was by no means unfounded. They'd previously proven their worth to the Americans in battle. The carriers in question had been the launch ships for a large number of aircraft that flew sorties over Japan to drop explosives. Although these raids weren't especially significant in military terms, they did demonstrate just how dangerous American attacks could be. That's why Japan felt it needed to wipe these particular carriers out. Yamamoto's idea was to entice the American carriers away from safety so they could then be attacked. The way to do this, he reasoned, would be to launch an assault on territory held by the US in the Pacific Ocean. The Americans would have to respond to that by sending out their forces. Hawaii would have been an option for Yamamoto's attack, but ever since Pearl Harbor the Hawaiian Islands had been strongly fortified. So, the Japanese admiral's attention turned to Midway, which was being used by the Americans as a refueling station and submarine base. The plan wouldn't necessarily be easy to execute. The Japanese would have to be precise, ensuring several of their units were working in sync with one another. Yamamoto decided to send his forces out over a wide area, meaning his ships weren't all clumped together. There were pros and cons to such an approach. With Japanese ships spread out from one another, they ran less risk of being spotted. After all, if several ships had been massed together, they'd be much more conspicuous. But on the other hand, these great distances between the ships meant they couldn't easily back one another up when hostilities did break out. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see now that the Japanese plan actually had issues that would ultimately prove insurmountable. For one thing, the intelligence they were receiving in the build-up to the battle was actually misleading. Working with compromised information is a bad place to be for a force about to engage in battle. Things were even worse than that for the Japanese. Not only was their intel off the mark, but their enemies had actually come to learn what they'd planned. American codebreakers had gleaned a great deal of information. This is what ultimately condemned the Japanese to defeat. The American codebreakers had learned that a Japanese attack somewhere in the Pacific Ocean was imminent. They initially didn't know the specifics, but they were aware that the target was denoted as AF in Japanese code. Suspecting AF may have been Midway, the Americans sent out a message stating that the base there was running low on drinking water. That wasn't true, but when the Japanese picked up on that fake message, they inadvertently revealed their hand. The Japanese sent a message to their own forces saying AF was running low on water, which confirmed that Midway was indeed their target. The Americans picked up on this message and now could prepare for the coming assault. Admiral Chester Nimitz was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific area on the American side. He calculated that if the Americans were to overcome the Japanese attack, they would require no fewer than 4 carriers, and maybe 5. As many planes as they could dispatch would be needed for the coming battle. The USS Hornet and the USS Enterprise were ready to go, but Nimitz needed more backup. So, he ordered the USS Yorktown to sail to Midway from the Southwest Pacific. The vessel had recently been damaged, and its repairs weren't quite complete, but it was needed. Nimitz could only rely on those 3 carriers in the end. His plans for 4 or 5 fell short, and that wasn't his only problem. Garnering sufficient numbers of aircraft also proved tricky, and some older planes ended up having to be pressed back into active service. By June 3 there was no more time left to prepare. The Battle of Midway got underway. A number of American aircraft took to the skies and were greeted by heavy fire from the Japanese. The American planes managed to drop their explosives, but they returned to Midway without having inflicted much damage upon the enemy. Early the following day, Japan sent more than 100 planes to Midway Island itself. An hour after they'd set out, the Americans spotted them and sent their own craft to the sky. A terrible battle began in the air, with the Japanese ultimately winning out. A great number of American aircraft were destroyed. Japanese losses were minimal in comparison. But despite the Japanese success in shooting down American planes, vitally they had failed to damage the runways on the island. That meant the Americans could still launch planes from there, which later helped prove decisive. American aircraft, meanwhile, started to attack the Japanese carriers. One pilot took a tremendous risk by flying incredibly close to the Akagi carrier. It meant, though, that the Japanese ran the risk of damaging their own carrier if they tried to take this pilot out. As all this was playing out, an American submarine called the Nautilus was also engaging the Japanese fleet. It didn't actually cause any actual damage, but it did prove to be a useful distraction. The Americans couldn't really match the Japanese when it came to the rate at which they were launching planes into the sky. In fact, American planes would regularly be sent out in small batches. Although this made it easier for the Japanese to take them out, it did have one advantage. Because the Americans dispatched small numbers of aircraft over and over again, it meant the Japanese were constantly having to defend themselves. Their forces never really had the opportunity to prepare an attack of their own. The early engagements went pretty badly for the United States. American forces sustained many losses, which wasn't helped by the fact many of their aircraft were outmoded and simply not up to the task at hand. Torpedoes, too, weren't hitting their targets and sometimes weren't even exploding as they should have. But the persistent waves of American attacks did eventually begin to bear fruit. As the Japanese sought to defend themselves, their defensive shape began to unravel. Vulnerabilities were becoming evident. Luck plays its part in any battle, and while the Americans exhibited a great deal of skill, many would argue that a little good fortune helped with what came next. A group of aircraft managed to break through the Japanese defenses together before proceeding to take out 3 Japanese carriers. They'd only had 4 to begin with. The 3 destroyed carriers were the Kaga, the Akagi, and the Shipwreck, leaving the Shipwreck as the last Japanese carrier operational. The Americans were in a great position now, but all the same victory was far from assured just yet. The Japanese fought back hard. A wave of aircraft was launched from the Shipwreck, which engaged the Americans ferociously. Bombs were dropped upon the USS Yorktown, which ended up taking a huge amount of damage. Holes had opened up across the vessel, and internal damage was severe. The Yorktown's speed slowed horribly as a result of the bombing. It was now, essentially, a sitting duck, awaiting the next wave of Japanese aircraft to attack. Things were looking grim for the carrier and all on board. Despite the bleak outlook, repair works were called for aboard the Yorktown, and they initially proved to be remarkably swift and successful. By the time a second wave of attacks came, it appeared to the Japanese that they were literally attacking a different carrier altogether. It had been given a whole new lease of life. Still, though, the Japanese attack proved devastating again. A couple of torpedoes smashed into the Yorktown, and its power was diminished once more. The Japanese were delighted, believing that they'd just taken out a second carrier. Still, as the battle wore on, it couldn't be denied that it was the Americans that had come out on top when it came to the carriers. The Japanese had lost all of theirs, but they still had other ships at their disposal. In fact, the threat they posed was still so great that the Americans decided to pull their own carriers back to protect them. But the Americans didn't just give up on the fight entirely. They continued to send ships out to search for the enemy and, ultimately, to neutralize any threat they posed. This went on for a few. Still, as the battle wore on, it couldn't be denied that it was the Americans that had come out on top when it came to the carriers. The Japanese had lost all of theirs, but they still had other ships at their disposal. In fact, the threat they posed was still so great that the Americans decided to pull their own carriers back to protect them. But the Americans didn't just give up on the fight entirely. They continued to send ships out to search for the enemy and, ultimately, to neutralize any threat they posed. This went on for a few days. The American assaults managed to score some significant victories during that spell. They took out a number of vital ships belonging to the Japanese fleet, including a heavy cruiser known as the Mikuma and a pair of destroyers called the Asashio and the Arashio. The Japanese were undeniably suffering by this late stage in the battle. But they weren't quite done yet. They continued to fight back, and ultimately they inflicted the final major loss of the engagement. The Japanese still had a submarine out there, hidden beneath the surface and readying itself to inflict some terrible damage upon the Americans. It fired its torpedoes, which smashed into the ailing Yorktown. There would be no successful repairs this time. The carrier was finished. That wasn't all. The USS Hamman was also hit while it was attempting to assist with the Yorktown's repairs. The Hamman split in half, and 80 sailors lost their lives when it, too, sank to the bottom of the ocean. That last Japanese assault had been really damaging, but it couldn't hide the overall extent of their losses. By the end of the Battle of Midway, the Americans had unquestionably emerged as the victors. The contest between the carriers had obviously been won by the United States, which lost only 1 compared to Japan's 4. And when it came to the number of aircraft lost, again the United States emerged from the battle in better shape. It had lost 150, while Japan had lost 248. That constituted literally every last plane it had dispatched. And in terms of casualties, too, Japanese losses were far greater than those sustained by the United States. With more than 3,000 dead, Japan had lost roughly 10 times as many men as its enemy. And considering the wider context surrounding the battle, the Americans had also come out on top. The United States had been successful in defending its territory, which had the wider effect of maintaining control over the wider Pacific Ocean. Japanese expansion had been held at bay, which proved vitally important. Looking back now, many historians consider the Battle of Midway to have been a true turning point in how World War II played out as a whole. Momentum swung in favor of the Americans, which was now in position to attack rather than simply defend itself against the enemy. The Americans were stronger after what had happened at Midway, and it arguably set the scene for their overall victory 3 years later. Whichever way you look at it, the Battle of Midway was of key importance. You can see why, then, the researchers at the Ocean Exploration Trust have been working so hard to explore the seas where the Battle of Midway took place. Given how historically important the engagement had been, it's understandable that people would want to learn everything they could about it. By analyzing the watery shipwrecks and shooting video footage and images of them, experts felt they might be able to discern new information about what had happened over the course of those bloody days of battle in 1942. Because of the team's efforts, a number of the ships that had gone under during the battle were seen once again. Some 8 decades or so have now passed since the terrible events at Midway took place, but the ruined vessels remain fixed in place in their watery grave, fully 16,000 feet below the surface. The USS Yorktown was one of the ships the team managed to find, plus the Japanese vessels Kaga and Akagi. Having survived only in infamy and memory up until this point, these vessels were now tangibly brought back into people's lives. The location of the carrier Akagi had actually been noted in 2019 during a mapping survey, but it hadn't been investigated in great detail before. That initial study had been undertaken by a company called Vulcan Incorporated, with assistance from the US Navy. But this time it was the people aboard the Nautilus running things. They put in some 14 hours analyzing the Akagi, paying special attention to the signs of damage that the vessel exhibited. They wanted to learn more about its demise. The analysis of the Yorktown also generated a great deal of interest from experts and the public alike. The American carrier had been located a quarter of a century ago, but this was the first time that anyone had been able to look at it in real time. The feed shot from the RAV made for fascinating viewing. The explorers also managed to locate and analyze the Japanese ship Kaga. The data they collected about the vessel is intended to be released to the chief scientist for the Ocean Exploration Trust is Dr. Daniel Wagner. In a statement, he expressed his excitement at the work that his team has been doing. He seems to believe that their efforts are genuinely providing fresh insights to this decades-old story. This expedition is not only rewriting history and our understanding of these special places, he said, but also pushing the limits of what we thought was possible in terms of interdisciplinary collaboration. Dr. Wagner went on to discuss some of the work he and his colleagues had done and the things they'd encountered while doing it. During over 43 hours at depth, he began, we methodically circumnavigated these historic wrecks, bringing to light many features in great detail, including their armament, battle, and sinking-related damage. It must have been quite an experience for the team, seeing these vessels frozen in time at the moment of their demise. Many anti-aircraft guns were still pointing up, Dr. Wagner said, providing clues about the final moments on these iconic ships. Dr. Wagner wasn't the only person involved in this project to have been especially touched by the historic and emotional significance of the work they've been doing. Dr. Rick Spinrad, an administrator with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration (NOAA), is another expert who has been moved by his involvement in the collaborative effort. To explore Papanamoku Key Marine National Monument and these iconic naval ships is a solemn privilege on many levels, he said. NOAA is grateful to the monument trustees, our partners, and the Nautilus expedition team, who have made it possible to venture to these extreme depths and share these discoveries with the world. The seafloor around the Midway Atoll is littered with fascinating relics of the past. The great ships, the aircraft that fell from the sky, they all tell a story of the past. But without work from the likes of those involved in this project, those stories won't ever be told. As Dr. Wagner put it, the vast majority of our ocean lies in very deep waters that we know virtually nothing about. These deep-sea explorations highlight how many extraordinary things are still hidden and waiting to be found in the great depths of our ocean. Of course, while this particular project was focused so intently on the Battle of Midway, the wider Papanamoku Key Marine National Monument area possesses many other historical treasures, too. Countless sailors have floated through the region through the generations, so there are more than just World War II shipwrecks in those waters. Some 60 ships are thought to have been lost in this area over time, and that's just what the official record states. Perhaps there are other wrecks in the depths that absolutely nobody around today yet knows about? The earliest known shipwreck at Papanamoku Key traces back to the year 1818. It just goes to show how much history this region is hiding. 4 years after that, 2 vessels went under during a single, dreadful night, and their wrecks have since been marked by the naming of nearby atolls. The ships were called the Hermes and the Pearl. Exploration of these waters is a fascinating endeavor, and it looks set to continue into the future. Who knows what stories will be uncovered down the line, whether they're related to the pivotal Battle of Midway or to something else entirely. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.